Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 80. At the Burgh School in Kirkcaldy, one of the best in Scotland, Adam Smith had 4 years' training in the classics. Nearby was the Glasgow Ironworks, called the Nailery, which he enjoyed visiting and which would figure in the opening pages of The Wealth of Nations. In 1737, he entered Glasgow College, where he improved his Latin and Greek and came under the influence of the never-to-be-forgotten Francis Hutchinson, 1694 to 1746, the first professor there to lecture in English instead of Latin, who defied the Scottish Calvinists by teaching a cheerful and beneficent God who governed the world for what he called, quote, the greatest good of the greatest number, end of quote. The Oxford, where Adam Smith entered Balliol College as a scholarship student in 1740, was, quote, steeped in port and prejudice, end of quote. Comfortably endowed dons and professors received their salaries, quote, from a fund altogether independent of their success and reputation in their particular professions, end of quote. The colleges showed how, quote, teachers are likely to make a common cause, to be all very indulgent to one another, and every man to consent that his neighbor may neglect his duty, provided he himself is allowed to neglect his own. In the University of Oxford, the greater part of the public professors have, for these many years, given up altogether even the pretense of teaching, end of quote. They taught him one lesson he never forgot: the fate of any institution that did not depend on the goodwill of its customers. Still, he read widely and had time to reflect, and turned from his growing interest in mathematics back to the Latin and Greek classics, which dominated the Balliol Library. The only intrusion of university authorities into his education was when they caught him reading David Hume's recently published Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, but luckily he escaped with only a reprimand and the confiscation of the book. His family hoped he would stay at Oxford for an academic career, but he refused to take the necessary holy orders. Back in Scotland, he pursued his academic interests under freer auspices. In Edinburgh, he gave a series of public lectures on English literature, a novel subject, to an audience of 100 citizens who paid a guinea each. In 1750 to 51, he offered a public course on economics, a subject never yet heard of in Oxford's sanctimonious halls. The success of these lectures brought him a chair at the University of Glasgow, first as professor of logic, then as professor of moral philosophy. He was preaching commercial liberty, an idea already stirring Scotland at the time, and it was said that his lectures converted the city to his gospel of free trade. In the mid-18th century, Glasgow, an ancient provincial Scots city of some 25,000, was washed by the currents of the future. Situated on both sides of the River Clyde, it had long been a center of religion and education, and of commerce with Northern Europe. After the union with England in 1707, Glasgow profited too from the commerce with America. Andrew Cochrane, the provost of the city, had just founded a political economy club when Adam Smith arrived as professor, and promptly enlisted him as a member. Glasgow merchants, locally known as, quote, tobacco lords, had prospered from the removal of restrictions on their trade with the colonies, and were now agitating against the import duties on the American iron that supplied the Glasgow Ironworks. Cochrane's Ironworks was then every year importing 400 tons of iron. It would be a disaster for Glasgow merchants when the American colonies ended their trade in tobacco. Meanwhile, Adam Smith joined with his club members, quote, to inquire into the nature and principles of trade in all its branches, and to communicate knowledge and ideas on the subject to each other, end of quote. For many facts in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith acknowledged his debt to the practical-minded Cochrane. Adam Smith's first work, his Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, already showed his knack for simple explanation of complex problems. He described the moral sentiment by a simple figure of speech, an inner man, an impartial spectator within each of us who passes judgment on everything we do from the point of view of other people. Quote, I consider what I should suffer if I were really you, end of quote. This, he explained, was quite different from self-love. He had already noticed that to serve society we are, quote, led by an invisible hand, end of quote. Smith's fellow Scotsman, David Hume, facetiously reported from London, quote, "Nothing indeed can be a stronger presumption of falsehood than the approbation of the multitude." And Phocion, always suspected himself of some blunder when he was attended with the applause of the populace. Supposing that you have prepared yourself for the worst by all these reflections, I proceed to tell you the melancholy news that your book has been very unfortunate, for the public seemed disposed to applaud it extremely. It was looked for by the foolish people with some impatience, and the mob of literati are beginning already to be very loud in its praises, end of quote. With the bad news of success, Hume noted that he, quote, heard it extolled above all books in the world, end of quote, and the pundits had already ranked Adam Smith among, quote, the glories of English literature, end of quote. The book unpredictably gave Adam Smith his only opportunity to reach out to the larger world of European thought. Incidentally, it led to an annuity that provided him the leisure to write his great work. Among the admirers of Adam Smith's moral sentiments was Charles Townshend, 1725 to 1767, who, Hume reported from London, quote, passes for the cleverest fellow in England, end of quote. It was a splendid irony that the good opinion of the author of the notoriously restrictive Townshend Acts, 1767, supported Adam Smith in writing the Bible of Free Trade. The Townshend Acts, violating the traditions of colonial self-government, pushed the American colonists on the irreversible course to revolution. Townshend, who had recently married the widow of the eldest son of the Duke of Buccleuch, was looking for a tutor to accompany his stepson, the young Duke, on the customary grand tour of the continent. Reading Adam Smith's moral sentiments, he at once decided that the author was his man, and he went straight to Glasgow to persuade his candidate to give up a professorship for this tutorial assignment. Some might have thought the abstracted professor ill-suited to guide a young man across the continent, for while showing Townshend the Glasgow sights, Smith took him to see the great tannery and absent-mindedly walked right into the tan pit. The determined Townshend offered Smith a salary of £300 a year, plus traveling expenses while abroad, and then a pension of £300 a year for life. This was an appealing proposition to a Glasgow professor whose income was only £170 a year. There was no pension for overage professors, who had to rely on the sum a successor might pay as the price of the chair. Adam Smith resigned his Glasgow chair and in 1764 set out with his charge on their grand tour. They were abroad for 2.5 years, spending about 1.5 years in Toulouse, where Hume's cousin was vicar general of the diocese, 2 months in Geneva, and nearly 1 year in Paris. Toulouse, then a favorite resort of the English, as Florence would be in the next century, offered the most cultivated French society outside of Paris. Without the distractions of the capital, Adam Smith had the leisure to begin to write his big book. During a 2-month interlude in Geneva, he enjoyed some conversations with Voltaire, then on to Paris, where Hume himself was secretary at the British Embassy. Smith and his charge attended the theater, glimpsed the fashionable salons, and encountered some seminal ideas. The brilliant François Quesnay, 1694 to 1774, King Louis XV's consulting physician who had been installed at Versailles under the patronage of Madame de Pompadour, enlisted Adam Smith in his French version of a political economy club. At 60, Quesnay had begun writing about economics, on which he had already become the king's pundit. Quesnay's Tableau économique, 1758, aiming to accomplish for social forces what Newton had done for physical forces, invented a whole vocabulary for the new science. Quesnay introduced the notion of economic classes, each with its own flow of products and receipts. He proposed the idea of economic equilibrium and planted ideas about capital, savings, and investment, which would flower into a vast literature of economic analysis in following centuries. His Tableau économique was first printed in a small edition on the king's private press, But when Madame de Pompadour warned him of the king's certain displeasure with such flighty notions, he let the work reach the large public under the name of the Marquis de Mirabeau. Quesnay's disciples, first known simply as les économistes, became famous as the physiocrats, offering the first modern model for economics. Their leading ideas were quite simple. A natural law similar to that governing the physical world governed the growth and flow of wealth. The wealth of a society consisted not in its store of gold and silver, but in its total stock of commodities, and the best way to increase that stock was to allow the free flow of products in the market without monopolies or tax restrictions. These pioneer economists were appalled by the poverty of the French peasantry, in stark contrast to the luxury of the nobles, the tax farmers, and other monopolists. Quote, "Poor peasants, poor kingdom," they proclaimed. "Poor kingdom, poor king," end of quote. Their remedy for the nation's ills focused on the plight of the peasants. Improve the techniques of agriculture, remove all blocks to the flow of goods, abolish all existing taxes and all the tax farmers, and instead establish a single tax on the product of the soil to be collected by honest government officers. When Quesnay was offered a collector generalship of taxes for his son, he refused. "No," he said, "let the welfare of my children be bound up with the public prosperity." And he made his son a farmer. If Louis XV had only listened to Quesnay, he might have prevented much misery for France, and have saved his own grandson from the guillotine. And there we'll conclude part 2 of chapter 80.